this is the race for World First, and it's something unto itself.
Ian, thanks so much for taking some time to join us today.
No, it's a pleasure.
Absolutely. So I know Ny'alotha, obviously the race to World First just ended recently.
Yeah.
And there's been some questions that have come up about how the race was handled and also where things go from here as far as these races are concerned. So to start off, how do you feel the whole thing went?
So honestly, I think it's been a thrilling couple of weeks, right? It's fun to see hundreds of thousands of people following along live. It's a unique insight, and there's nothing quite like it, I think, in gaming, streaming, esports, if you want to call it that. There's obviously tons of other large events, but this sort of raw, unfiltered, real-time look at an event that spans days or weeks even is unique. And so it was really exciting to see, for the first time in a while, a North American guild come out on top. Congratulations to Limit. They really played just remarkably well from start to finish throughout the tier. Kudos to Max, their raid leader and coach, kind of shot calling from his vantage point throughout the whole thing. And Method this time were the close runners up, but it was tightly contested and exciting the whole way through.
Yeah. So now that Limit and Method have really moved to do everything streamed, right?
Yeah.
This whole thing's blown up in a huge way. It used to be that Mythic rating was sort of this mysterious thing that was happening, and then you would hear about a World First maybe if you were paying attention. But now you had 150,000 people at one point. That's actually more, by the way, than the Call of Duty opening day. Like, it was just huge. So now that there's so much visibility, when issues come up, everybody sees them happen, right? So what was your plan going in for handling those things if they came up, and then how well do you feel that plan worked?
Our plan is we are watching the race ourselves. We have people in the top guilds, as well as many folks in a sort of high-end community, whether they're professional PvPers or whatever else, have folks that they can reach out to directly that they know on the team here through having met at BlizzCon or other channels. And so people from both Limit and Method were able to email in if they were running into issues or potential bugs they wanted to report that could get our attention focused on them faster. A couple times, over the course of the weekend or even during the Super Bowl, we had folks, texting back and forth, trying to get a hotfix tested and deployed to resolve an issue that we were running into. So it definitely is a unique sort of 24/7 event.
Right.
I mean, there are some unfortunate circumstances that result from that. We do have to sleep sometimes.
Of course.
I think earlier on, there was a quirk with the boss Raden in the first couple days of the race that was allowing, he was respawning faster than
Massive
typically
warlock
intended.
Yep.
Exactly, right. So Method and a few other guilds saw a loophole there that they could use to take advantage of to get an advantage on the fight. We probably would have fixed that had we seen it unfolding in real time.
Okay.
But by the time we woke up and saw what had happened, we generally have a much different standard for the sorts of changes we will make once a boss has been defeated.
I see.
Because of course, if we change that respawn timer immediately, we've now made the playing field unfairly harder for every guild that follows Method within this same timer, because they can't use this technique that a guild was able to benefit from. And obviously in the case of a true exploit or taking advantage of a bug in an abusive way, we would fix it and punish someone who abused it.
Yeah.
But here, this was just a quirk of the boss and kind of the definition of creative use of game mechanics.
Sure.
It's like, we don't clear those stacks when the encounter ends. We've seen people do clever things over the years, whether it's bringing outside mobs into encounters to help build resources or whatever else. And it's up to us to adjust if we don't like how that's playing out, but it's not something they'd ever punish anyone for.
And you waited until Tuesday, essentially, to go ahead and make the fix at that
Exactly.
point. And I guess the contrast to that would be the other Rodden issue where Limit was actually using pre-immunities, I believe, and then you made that change on the fly. I'm guessing that was because no one had downed it yet, and you felt like that was
exactly
appropriate.
Yeah, and I think that's, obviously those are bugs/oversights
Sure.
where using player abilities, using immunities in ways that let you feel powerful, let you kind of have an out. Personally, when targeted by a mechanic is awesome, but when they can be used in a way that effectively removes a mechanic from the fight, we also want to make sure that the strat going forward isn't, okay, stack immunity classes, and you're not allowed to bring anyone who doesn't have an immunity in these key roles, because then you have to deal with this mechanic. We wanted to nip that in the bud. And as we saw, we're also mindful of how much what we're doing is going to invalidate a guild's progress. I think despite some initial grumbling, Limit, to their credit, turned around, killed the boss not too long after that.
Yeah, it was just a couple hours.
Exactly. But yes, I think in this case, had they gotten a kill using that tactic, we would have let it stand for the week.
I see.
Made the same change, but that change would have come with the weekly reset and potentially had some offsetting nerf to the boss's health or other abilities. So getting back to the earlier question about the way that the live streaming of the whole thing and the exposure has changed it, it definitely it shines a light on, whenever there's a bug, whenever there's an issue, it's magnified in ways that we haven't seen in the past. And that's something that is causing us to reflect upon our processes and community expectations around that. For a long time now, we've avoided public testing of our end mythic raid encounters because there is something exciting about, that moment of surprise where you see Cho'Gall come in for the first time as you thought you were defeating Imperator Margok at the end of Highmaul, and holy crap, there's a whole extra phase here. Or, not having the time to practice and build your boss mods and all of those things before that encounters come out. But the inherent trade-off there is, despite our QA team's best efforts and our internal raid team's best efforts, they may spend a dozen hours, on a single raid encounter as a raid group, and then individual testers will spend much more time, trying to run through reproducible steps to find bugs. That's not going to necessarily compare to the time that a full raid guild or multiple full raid guilds doing hundreds of attempts can put into an encounter and some of the edge cases they're likely to find.
Right.
And so we have this trade-off of we want to keep the encounters exciting, a little bit of a surprise, but we are also conceding that they're receiving slightly less robust testing than some of our other encounters. And this isn't an area where, and I hate to say this because it sounds like an excuse, like, oh yeah, there've always been bugs. But actually, this is kind of par for the course. It's just that the world's seeing it for the first time.
Right.
If you go, Method can certainly tell you some stories. If you go back and talk to guilds like Paragon from days back, there have been a wide number of issues, whether it was mechanics that were broken, or often it's not necessarily things that are bugs per se, but abilities that can line up in certain ways that feel unfair or that can just arbitrarily wipe you if the same person gets targeted by two things. Those are, again, harder to catch without PTR and throwing thousands of people in an encounter. Those have always come up. They've been hotfixed. It's just that normally when there was this secretive environment around the whole thing, no one knows how the progress is going. At the end of the day, the one guild comes out with their kill and their kill video, and the encounter looks, clean and complete from start to finish. We don't necessarily hear about what happened along the way. Now the whole world's seeing it. And it's understandably frustrating for players in the spotlight with that pressure to feel like their encounter attempts are being thwarted by bugs on our end. And it's embarrassing for us and the team who want to, have our game seen in the best light and put our best foot forward there. And something we're talking a lot about, how we can improve our processes there going forward.
You've always been known for that AAA polish, right? That final bit of just everything's glossy and nice, and you don't run into these things. And obviously, being a world first guild, they're going to encounter some of those things at the end. Yeah. That said, I think most of the bosses, there might have been an issue or two there, but N'Zoth seemed like there was a lot going on there in terms of issues that may have come up, right? So there was the thought harvesters maybe starting to cast when they had like a warlock gate or something nearby, and now you've got them where they actually go to the players before they start casting, or
so that was actually okay. So talking about N'Zoth the Corruptor in particular, let me see if my best recollection of the issues encountered off the top of my head.
I'll help you fill in any gaps.
I think that they're really, so in terms of straight up bugs, the bonus 25% phase that was confusing to people, where it was firing a second time as the backstop, that was kind of the single biggest bug per se. The first issue that was run into was where this was where the Zoth was despawned for limit to apply a hotfix. This wasn't a bug per se; it was just a workaround, and it was limit realized, again to their credit, hey, what if we just don't go into this portal at all?
Right.
What if we just ignore the gateway? We can heal through this pulsing damage, with a robust healing core, and just burn the boss. And that was, again, one of those cases where we have our intended ways, are the ways that we imagine a guild is going to tackle an encounter. I would say most bosses end up with a final strat or the initial kill video not perfectly replicating what we imagined, and that's fine. That's actually great, I would say. Yeah. That's a hallmark of players' ingenuity, and we definitely don't want to have one prescribed path. But when that ingenuity leads to entirely skipping a phase of the encounter and bypassing it entirely, that's something we wanted to correct. Yeah. And so while not a bug, that was just a tuning adjustment. Like, okay, let's make the pulsing AoE the boss does when the gateway to the heart chamber opens effectively lethal after 12 or so seconds. No, really go in and do this phase. Yeah. And so that was like the one big change. The Thought Harvester stuff was actually more quality of life and us looking at changes in response to feedback that Limit was sending us. So they were emailing us during the encounter with a couple of bug reports or concerns. And one of the main ones that came up, and to be clear, Method does this as well, other top guilds do. Sure. There's no aspect of favoritism here. We're just looking at their feedback and the concerns about the unpredictability and a feeling of randomness in controlling Thought Harvesters and where they were doing their casts and where they were placed. And so one change that we made initially in response to that feedback was, well, what if we let them just be able to cast this spell while moving so that you have more control over where they're going? Clearly, that effectively had, that made things harder for them with the strat they were using. We quickly heard that, okay, we were making a qualitative change here, it didn't have the intended effect, let's roll it back. And then kind of went back to the drawing board, thought about a different approach, ended up simply having them prioritize spawning on tanks over random players in the raid, and that provided the desired level of control and consistency so that, again, it felt like they could make steady progress. Yeah. One of the things that we look at most when we're monitoring how guilds are progressing, because a question that we often have is this killable? We don't, we're doing our best guess in terms of tuning. We want to make sure there's nothing that's unfairly hard or impossible to overcome. One of the things that we look at is just, well, what's wiping them? What's killing them? And one of the things we want to avoid is excessive randomness, is a feeling that, okay, if we just get a bad spawn here, the attempt's over, and only on one pull in 4, one pull in 5, do the stars align and let them continue to progress. These are some of the best players in the world. We know they're going to master the execution within a certain number of pulls, and so if we're still seeing wipes due to a certain mechanic, we're immediately starting to look at, well, okay, what's unpredictable about it that we could control better? And so, that wasn't technically a bug. It was just an example of on-the-fly adjustment to something that they raised as a source of randomness and that we agreed was a source of randomness. And then, of course, the 25% thing, which, again, I don't want to sound defensive here, but I think its impact was a little bit overblown. Limit only ran into this a handful of times. By definition, they had to get the boss to 25% health, which wasn't happening at all for the first few days. Yeah. And then on, I think it was Thursday morning, they had a pull where they wiped right at 25%. The gateway respawned there. Our designers saw this, immediately set out to implement a fix. And I think we've explained this a couple of times on Twitter and elsewhere, but the way it was intended to work is, I think it was just over 2 minutes into phase 2, the Ny'alotha was supposed to shield himself, gateway to the heart chamber opens, you have to go in, complete that phase in order to come out and continue the fight. There was a backstop that was put in, where also at 25% health, if the boss was somehow DPS down to 25% health, sooner than that 2-minute timer, the gateway would spawn anyway.
Which would theoretically never happen.
It should, in the short term, though, again, we never know in terms of what people are going to be able to muster, but also in the long run, people come back over-geared. Right. That's something we often do, right, where there can be 2 conditions for triggering a phase. For example, Queen Ashara in Eternal Palace would begin her last phase when all of the handmaidens were killed or she reached 40% health, whichever one happened first. Right. Because, again, we want to make sure that, you can't just skip a mechanic entirely. And so there was actually a code bug that we found that was, in some circumstances, causing that or to effectively become an and. So instead of 2 minutes or 25% health, it was doing both.
I see.
And so we saw that, pushed out a fix a couple of hours later, and I think some of the initial confusion, again, part of the mystery of doing progress on these bosses is you don't know exactly how it's supposed to work. There is no dungeon journal explicitly spelling out the intended fight structure. And so as far as Limit knew, their initial take on this was like, wait, the 25% phase is broken, the boss is bugged. The initial reaction we heard from them was they weren't sure if they were okay to proceed because they didn't want to, get a bugged or illegitimate kill that might, tarnish its perception. And that's why we, quickly got out messaging to reassure them, no, this is like what you're seeing now is how the fight's supposed to be. Carry on. And then they, got it together. It was amazing seeing them go from, hitting the Zerk with the boss at 20-25% health to actually getting a kill over the course of a couple of days of optimization.
So when you look at, you talked for a moment there about how long you sort of expect guilds to spend on a given encounter. Do you feel like Carapace went down a lot faster than you expected in one day with something like 68, 70 wipes or so?
Yes, I would say I think there are a couple of bosses that I think were a little bit off the mark tuning-wise.
Okay.
Carapace ended up a bit easier than intended.
Mm-hmm.
Wipe count isn't always the
It's
best
not the best
measure.
metric, I agree.
Because I think it was also about 12 hours of consecutive pulls by one of the very best guilds in the world.
Right.
And the part of Carapace that I think was a bit off tuning-wise was actually just the damage requirements in Phase 1. As a result, we saw them getting into the later phases of the fight almost right away.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what makes the pull count seem lower. But other guilds that have come in, in the aftermath, it's still a hard boss. People aren't killing Il'gynoth and they're just going and steamrolling Carapace and going straight on to Corruptor. Wipe counts are often dictated by where a fight has its difficulty. Mm-hmm. Like, I think of a boss like Blackhand, for example, a few expansions back.
One of my
had
favorites
some
of all
very
time.
super fun fight, had very high wipe counts, because like you'd spend, certainly an average Mythic guild could spend a whole week never getting past Phase 1 of the fight cleanly because of how intense it was. Mm-hmm. But you can get in a whole lot of 60-second pulls in a given night versus, what we saw in Carapace, they were getting 5-6 minutes into the fight pretty much every time.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there was the issue there with, you mentioned this on Twitter, where they, at about 30 corruptions, sometimes they would get mind controlled, and that was just an intermittent issue.
So again, okay, that's one of those,
Yeah.
that was so, definitely, that was a definite bug, and one of the worst ones that popped up. That's a super edge case. It's one of those that's just, again, I hate it. It's easy to sound like I'm just making excuses here.
Sure.
It literally is like a sub 1 in 1,000 thing.
Yeah.
It's due to a tiny race condition. When a sanity draining event applies to a player, there was a chance based on a fraction of a second timing that it could basically double count. It could double drain sanity. And so this was happening occasionally, right? So over the course of the entire fight, all 20 people in the raid are getting hit by countless sanity draining effects. Sometimes it would drain a little bit of extra sanity. This actually could happen on other difficulties too. It just wasn't noticed. It could have happened on PTR, it just wasn't noticed. It only started to be noticed when Limit was making it deep into the fight, where you're intended to be running very low on sanity, every point counts, and people would notice, hey, what the heck, I just went insane there, really dig into the logs, go back at videos and look at, hey, look at this 5-second clip on Twitch. You can see they went from 40 to 0 when they only got hit by one thing. As soon as we found that, we fixed it.
Yeah.
And again, I think Limit probably would have killed it a few pulls earlier, but most of their execution was perfecting getting to that point in the fight, getting the boss to, the low 20s health-wise, figuring out the use of space in the room.
Right.
And it was only at the very, very end where sanity was a roadblock. Once that bug was fixed, they got the kill.
Talking a little bit about the communication you have with some of these top guilds, when you look at other esports that are more treated as esports, right? This has become the most popular WoW esport, but it's definitely driven by the community. And is there room, you think, for more public communication from your team whenever these types of issues come up? I think people think of it, this is a Blizzard esport, but we're never hearing from Blizzard about these things.
It's an area, I think we're slow to adapt. In the past, we've never really communicated publicly about these hotfixes because it was like, this is a bug that literally affects 20 humans in the world right now, or 40 humans in the world right now. And so, whoever, like the lead encounter designer would just email raid leaders from, Limit and Method to say, hey, we're working on a fix for this issue. You should see it go live in the next hour. And the reality is, for the other millions of people playing the game, it was irrelevant. Now, with everybody seeing it publicly, that changes things. I think the term esport is tricky, though, because this isn't fair. It's not. It's an organic community event.
Yeah.
But it isn't structured to be a perfect, equal race in all regards. Time zones are a factor. When people get the patches is a factor. The organic nature of different server economies, the way all those things play out, shape how it unfolds. And I think it's one of the greatest community events, if not the greatest community event in all of gaming. And we love it and we want to support it. But esport is tricky label to apply because I think when you look at the traditional definition, those are structured, templated, regimented. All right, everyone's starting at the exact same starting line, racing towards the same finish line with clear rules. This isn't that.
Yeah.
This is the race for World First, and it's something unto itself.
Is there the possibility that we'll see a simultaneous release for all regions?
I think that's unlikely. Okay. Part of it is what that does to the rest of the world. Even Mythic difficulty, which is, okay, this is the elite difficulty in our raid structure, there are still tens of thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands, jumping into that the first week. And the reason why our raid resets are staggered is simply time zones, right? No one wants a raid to reset at 8 p.m. in the evening in their local time and have to plan around that. That would be utterly strange. And so when you look at the options for how we would deliver this, it's either we delay North America until Europe and Asia also reach their regular times,
right.
At which point does North America now just have a 5-day raid week instead of a 7-day raid week? If that's the case, that's not fair to them. If we shift out the whole thing, well, again, then what does that do to all the other players who just have their regular expectations of wanting to jump in and raid on a regular schedule that is calibrated to the time zones of each respective region? And I think if we do our job right, in the long run, the time zone difference doesn't matter. There are pros and cons, but unless a raid is undertuned, like let's say Eternal Night or Emerald Nightmare was, where the whole thing is over in just a couple days, in which case, there's some imbalance. In the past, it always just seems to come down to the last couple of bosses, who can learn over the course of many days and dozens of hours, who can learn, Fallen Avatar and kill Jaden the fastest, who can learn, in this case, Jaina or Ashara or whoever, and that those, less than a day head start ends up not mattering in the long run.
So the obvious solution seems to be tournament realms, but we know you're not planning on that either, right?
And part of it is, this is the pinnacle of rating, of PvE progression in an MMO, and a lot of that is about, you build up your characters, and who do you have geared, and so much of the preparation that goes into it is, guilds studying the encounters, planning who they think will be best for a given boss late in the tier, who the hardest bosses will be, often running suboptimal comps for some of the easier encounters just so they can get more gear to the people that are going to shine in the later fights. And that's a huge part of the meta strategy. The second you had any kind of templated setup, a lot of that would go out the window. And this is frankly one of those, don't fix it if it ain't broke kind of things. We want to obviously polish the experience, improve bugs, improve communication, but at its core, it's been a thrilling competitive event that we don't want to meddle with because it's working great.
So you talked about gearing a little bit, so let's talk about itemization, right? So how do you feel the shift to corruption from Titanforging has played out?
Overall, we're happy with how corruption's playing out. There were some tuning issues. There still are some tuning issues, as of at least until I think tomorrow.
Not looking forward to my Echoing Void.
Sorry, but a whole new range of corrupted items become available. I think a couple of corruptions definitely overshadowed some of the others that made it feel like there was only the one or two right answers as opposed to a range. I think it's really what we like a lot is how it's made gearing choices interesting and deeper than they have been in a long time. I think it's one of the challenges, I think, is a section of the community still needing to kind of adapt and get past the sort of the pure simcraft-driven mindset that has dominated for the last couple of years, where it's like, well, it says this piece with infinite stars is an upgrade, even though it's a lower item level, I should wear it. Well, wait, does that push you into a bad corruption territory? Or that might be an upgrade on Shadhar and Maut, let's say, but are you really going to use that on Drestagath? Are you going to use that in other fights? Not necessarily. Can you afford to run enough corruption that you're being chased by the ad or having the Void Zone under you on this fight versus that fight? And at the high end, there have been a lot of interesting trade-offs where we see people running higher corruption values in some fights versus others, figuring out different ways to get to the budget that they want. Part of the feedback we've received is concern about sort of the amount of variance within the corruption pool.
Sure.
People asking, well, why are there different tiers of corruption? Why do I need to get the tier 3 piece as opposed to tier 1? At the end of the day, we are focused on the ratio of power to the points of corruption on the item and trying to keep that as consistent as possible. And I think in the long run in the system, some of those so-called tier 1 pieces are going to actually be the most valuable ones.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you get a 75 corruption Echoing Void piece or Infinite Stars piece, that's like
it's ridiculous.
Obviously, when the trait is overpowered, it's really, really good. Yeah. But beyond that, as you're trying to kind of play with corruption in your loadouts, if you think of it as almost like a game of Tetris, that's a giant block that you can't really move around too well. Like if you have 275 corruption pieces, you're not going to wear both of those, or you're in for a really, really bad time. Whereas if you have, a couple of 25s, a 15, a 30, you can mix and match much more, especially as your cloak gets leveled up, your corruption threshold goes up. If you're trying to stay under 40 on this fight because you don't want that ad chasing you, you have way more freedom and flexibility to do that. Corruption it's an A3 system. It's a Visions of N'Zoth system. This is not the future of WoW, but we're happy with how the experiment has played out. Certainly the thematic strength of it tied into the whole N'Zoth theme, the corruption theme in general, and it's letting us explore a world as we look to a future that doesn't have Warforging and Titanforging as these prominent elements.
Yeah, so I've had a 75 Infinite Stars, a 30 Echoing Void, and with Resistance sitting at about 65. Yep. And in Raid, it's great. The people dispel me all the time, mobility, and then in the world, I had a moment yesterday where I think I died like 5 times in 5 minutes and said, okay, I'm going to cleanse this now. It's not going to be good on Tuesday anyway, the Echoing Void, or at least not as good.
I mean,
so
it'll still be good. It just probably won't be doing
50% less.
Exactly. It won't be doing 20% of your damage if you're a Demon Hunter. Sorry.
But let's talk about some of the high points in the raid. So a lot of people have responded. It's been really entertaining to watch Sinesh. So what was the inspiration behind the soccer element of that? Soccer, yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think it's,
something new.
Yeah, exactly. I think at its core, our encounter design team over the years, there are certain tried and true elements. It's like, yep, there's clumping and spreading and stand in this and don't stand in this. And we're going to have those mechanics. And, it's different remixes of them with a certain thematic wrapper that suits a given encounter. And then periodically we want to come up with something that you haven't seen before, that asks you to do something you haven't thought about, whether it was defusing a bomb on Mechatork and trying to communicate that information in real time with folks over voice comms or in chat, or passing a ball around and avoiding obstacles.
Yeah.
And I think at its core, the rest of the encounter is very simple, right? It's pretty much don't stand in stuff that you shouldn't stand in, punch the boss, but then this adds an extra layer of cooperation and teamwork that's been really fun to see play out.
What of all the encounters would you say there's one that you're kind of most proud of in terms of the way that it innovated beyond what you've done before?
It's tricky, right? It's always tricky to pick like my favorite or the best.
Couple highlights then.
Couple highlights. I think, let's see. I love Rathian as a boss 1. Actually, I think doing a boss 1 of a raid there's a lot of challenges there as a designer.
It's a beautiful arena too.
Yeah, like you want something that is just a spectacle, that has some fun, engaging mechanics, but it can't be too hard. The whole point is it's boss 1. Like if you're getting frustrated and feeling like you're bashing your head into a brick wall for a wide range of guilds, well then I guess this raid isn't for you. And I think that kind of nailed the balance of interesting mechanics, great spectacle. I love the environment integration and the feel of Carapace, of like the progressing through 3 separate areas. You're actually kind of cutting your way into the heart of this giant fleshy tentacle mountain that is N'Zoth.
Yeah.
Again, some like tuning issues on P1 on Mythic notwithstanding, that progression I think had a very, very unique feel to it. The goal was to, when we did 2 N'Zoth encounters, it's a little bit reminiscent of Deathwing with Spine of Deathwing and then Madness, but we wanted to have the feeling of like you're cutting a hole into this giant monstrosity in a more tangible way than we were able to deliver in Spine, and I think Carapace nailed that. Another favorite is actually, it's really fun to see Raden's mechanics remixed.
Yeah.
Like, I think that was an encounter that, for various reasons, tuning-wise and otherwise, either people didn't get to experience or that ended up falling flat because half of the mechanics were skipped in the killing strategy back in Pandaria. but kind of resurrecting it, adding a couple of tweaks to it, and bringing it back as a central theme for this encounter was pretty cool to see.
I've heard a few people talk about Drestagath in particular, just the unique combination of, okay, you can only do damage if you've collected this void pool, if you will. Was there any particular inspiration around that, or something they dreamed up over time? They're like, we have to have a tentacle boss. Is that?
Pretty much. I think the way the encounter design process generally goes is it's a multi-stage process.
Right.
Step one is, all right, what's the raid zone going to be? That's usually kind of dictated by high on narrative direction or creative direction for the game. All right, we're going to Firelands. Ragnaros is the end boss. We're going to Eternal Palace. Ashar is the end boss. Then the next step is, who are the cast of characters that fill this out? And sometimes it's drawing upon a couple of key recognizable characters that it makes sense to have show up, like Raden in this case, or a corrupted image of Rathion. Then the rest is using our imaginations. What would be fun to fight? What are some things that would be rad to see here? And what can the team get excited about? And so obviously, I think when thinking about Old Gods and the Black Empire, we know that they have a lot of slimes and tentacles and the goopy mess that we've seen in the different maws. So that was going to be one section. We've seen more of their military and the faceless ones and their generals, going all the way back to Vezax and the like from Ulduar, and more. And then once we have that list of bosses, we get together and brainstorm for about 30 minutes for each encounter, just to get a sense of not all the details of every mechanic, but how do you think the fight might go? Is this a two-phase fight? Is it like you're trying to make him vuln and do a bunch of damage, then other stuff comes out? Or are you passing an orb around and trying to, dispose of that, and that's the gimmick? And then after that, everyone just kind of puts their hands up within the encounter design group and volunteers for what they're most excited to work on. And in general, it almost always works out that different people have different tastes, and it's actually surprisingly easy to assign people bosses that they're excited about working on. And if at the end of the process there's a boss that no one put their hand up to work on as one of their top 2 or 3, well, then why are we making something that none of us are excited to make? Let's reconcept it.
Makes sense.
And so, something like Drestagath, I think the core idea was, ads and a central boss. The boss regenerates. You have to get something from the ads to be able to actually deal real damage to him. And then that was the core concept that was then fleshed out into a detailed encounter by the designer who owned it.
So I got to ask the question, just because it'll come up. So it was data mined that there seemed to be certain abilities and possibly even a carapace tentacle of some kind in the hidden phase on N'Zoth, and that led to a lot of speculation that there might have been a second secret phase. What exactly happened there?
So there was no extra second secret phase. I think the data mining. So World of Warcraft is developed in some quirky ways compared to a lot of games. Our game is set up around empowering our design team and our developers to make content quickly, to get data, to get things to do into the game with as few filters as possible. Because at the end of the day, we have millions of players who are hungry for new things to do, and we just want to empower our team to make it real. What that means is development happens in, for the most part, the live data milestone. So experiments, ideas that were discarded over the course of internal iteration long before a boss ever hit PTR, those are still living somewhere in the corners of our data. So when you see some experimental map that was made and not pursued, or you see some abilities that seem like they're tied to a boss, it's quite possible that those were there, again, long before PTR even happened. If you go back, Queen Ashara in Eternal Palace actually originally had an extra phase on top of what was there. There were additional ads that were coming out between phases 2 and 3. And at some point, based on internal feedback, we were thinking there's just too many separate types of ads. We're spending too much time doing things before we actually get to fight Ashara herself. Let's just remove this phase entirely. That's not because it was buggy or didn't work. It's just the natural process of iteration. But that iteration, once we're committed to making a specific patch, is happening in the data branch for that patch. So you're seeing all of our failed experiments if you look closely enough.
Do you feel, when you look back on sort of end-of-tier bosses like an Arius or a Blackhand or different ones, not necessarily end of expansion, but just end-of-tier, do you feel like N'Zoth lives up to what we expect from an end-of-tier boss compared to some of those others?
I do. Okay. I think it's some of our standards are from the first moment you pull the boss, it should feel different than heroic.
Right.
N'Zoth definitely does, right?
Yeah.
You're jumping right into the thick of things. And I think in terms of the overall difficulty curve, the number of pulls it's taken, the progression throughout, I think it certainly hits that bar. And some bosses are going to play out differently than others. Some have a whole new mechanic. Some have a whole new extra phase. Here it was more of an intermission that was inserted. Going back to Argus. Argus skipped a phase instead of the breaking apart into constellations. The boss was just empowered with a couple different abilities instead. We try to do something different each time. We always want to make the mythic capstone of a tier special. Yeah. And I'm happy with how N'Zoth came out.
Okay. The 21st Raider, we've known that that's been happening a little on the sidelines, but it was very visible this time with Maximum. And
yeah.
Both Limit and Method have gone on record saying that wasn't the factor as to why Method came in second. Was that something you kind of expected to happen eventually? Like, what are your general feelings on that, and how do you expect to see that kind of develop in the future?
It was really fascinating to watch. I think obviously being in a shared space without any latency on streaming, having that truly real-time ability to call things with no delay made that possible in a way that it maybe hasn't in the past, or even if you're just following on someone's remote stream, if you have even a couple of seconds of delay on what you're seeing occasionally, that whole strategy is going to fall apart. It's something we thought about. It's one of the concerns that actually, when we explore different uses of expanding spectator modes within our game, I think in the past, before flex rating was introduced, the idea of what if I could just be a spectator when I'm on the bench for my raid was something that came up a lot internally and from community suggestions. I think at this point, with most raiding modes other than Mythic letting you just not need a bench and bring in the extra person, that's less of a concern. But one of the things that gave us some pause when first thinking about it was, do we want the right way to play the game to be having somebody not actually participating in the encounter? Because I think you'd have to ask, Max about his details on the pros and cons. Clearly, they felt it was meaningfully advantageous, or they wouldn't have done it, because everything they're doing is something for a competitive advantage. And as somebody who's been a raid leader myself, there's no question that your performance in some area suffers. You can't, unless, no matter how great you are, no matter how superhuman you are, you can't perfectly execute your own individual rotation, damage, healing, whatever, while also micromanaging everything that your raid's doing, calling every cooldown, target priority. Something has to give. And being able to just focus 100% of his attention on which ad to prioritize, where to go next, when to use cooldowns, all of that definitely seems like it has its payoffs.
Particularly even worse when you're a tank, as he is, trying to be in the middle of the boss and not being able to see what's going on.
Exactly.
So.
It was interesting seeing them adapt on N'Zoth itself, where with half the raid in a different phase at a given point in time, you actually needed two POVs to be able to. Right, exactly. It's pulling the strings in the back.
Yeah, that made a lot of sense. Have you considered any sort of UI changes or providing additional data that might make it more spectator friendly?
In what sense?
Well, so for example, sometimes in esports, like you mentioned, observer mode. I doubt you'll do anything like that at this point. But is there certain sort of? Have you thought about? Okay, now that 100,000 people are watching this, is there more data that we could be providing that would allow for overlays that might make it more intriguing? I guess. Have you ever considered any of that?
I don't know that modifying our base UI to solve that problem makes a ton of sense.
Everybody modifies it anyway.
Exactly,
right.
And I think one of the cool things about the way this event plays out is that there are so many points of view available, right? You can watch the main method stream or the complexity stream and see it with casters and people bouncing around, or you can pick your favorite player to follow. You can pick a ranged DPS if you want. You can pick a healer if you want. Whichever one is going to be most useful to you and give you the most engaging experience, whether that's their personality or also just their vantage point, how they have their UI set up. There's a range of options to choose among, and I think people have, by and large, been able to find the one that is best for them.
Just coming into Shadowlands, you've obviously learned a lot, not just from this tier, but in prior tiers when it started to kind of get broadcasted. We've talked about a few things that you might want to try to do differently. So better communication. Do you think we'll see you communicate with the public more when things are happening, or?
Yeah, I think it's something our live support, community support, all of that just needs to level up. Yeah. And I think that having the spotlight on it, having all the people who are watching it, kind of forces that issue, makes it a necessity.
Yeah.
And we just don't have the structure in place historically to treat the raid opening that way.
Right.
And we're talking about staffing changes, things we can do to make sure that people are never left in the dark, never left without communication or insight into what's going on, that we can fix issues faster, and of course, do our best to prevent the issues from happening in the first place.
You alluded earlier to the idea of having the Mythic encounters actually be tested on PTR in their kind of full form. Is that something that you're definitely planning on, or is that still in consideration?
I would say still not the end bosses.
Right.
I think the vast majority of Mythic encounters do get tested in limited windows, both to find bugs, but also just for subjective feedback.
Right.
Like, is this mechanic really confusing? Is it hard to see? Is it really annoying? Do you all hate it?
Yeah.
Because those things are important and give us a chance to pivot and make an experience that's going to be better, not just for the World First raiders, but for the tens of thousands of folks that are going to come through Mythic over the course of the tier as the months unfold.
Sure.
But I think it's more about, for the end bosses, there is value in that moment of surprise. And it's something we intensely want to preserve, both in terms of seeing the mechanics, but also just having to learn the mechanics.
Right.
And we know that people will use every opportunity given to them to practice, and the more part of the race is decided based on PTR time, the less ideal that is for everybody involved.
Sure.
So I think it's more about looking at our testing processes and seeing what we can do to increase our level of confidence in these handful of encounters that don't make it onto PTR.
Are you pretty comfortable with the idea of 6 months between new raid tiers? That seems to sort of be the path that we're on right now.
Yeah, I think around that. I think it depends a little bit on the length of the tier, the size of the tier. But overall, it strikes a balance between, ideally, frankly, some people are starting to get antsy and complain that it's been too long, but that's always going to be one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, there's a whole new wave of people who are really grateful that they can actually get to the end of the tier, get their ahead of the curve, get their cutting edge.
Yeah.
And in the past, when we've seen tiers drag on for 8-9 months, that's brutal. But then there have also been times where, on the 4 or 5 month end of the spectrum, a lot of people just weren't quite done with their own personal progression and got frustrated that they were being rushed ahead into the next thing.
If I remember correctly, years ago, there actually was raid progression done at BlizzCon at one point. I think it was several BlizzCons back. You ever think we might see anything like that again? Or teams actually coming and doing their raid at BlizzCon?
Oh, right. You mean just the live raid races that we did? Right. Yeah. I remember, we had, Method in Midwinter or Vodka back in the day. Yeah. Possibly.
Yeah.
It's really logistically challenging.
A lot of people.
I think, it's coordinating that at a live event is, there's a lot of challenges that go into it. I think that the live PvE component at BlizzCon, I think Mythic Plus is a better vehicle for in some ways. You can still get a lot of the same, top players, high-profile folks doing non-PvP content in a competitive setting. But as an exhibition, as a chance to, show off, or to see who can speed clear the fastest, it's a thing we might go back to. I think one of the other challenges is we have a lot more games these days, which also makes stage time at BlizzCon very hotly contested. I think it was easier to fit those things in when, hey, we have WoW, and there's a StarCraft 2 expansion coming up, and otherwise that's kind of all we have going on versus the current climate.
Yeah. So I know we just have a few minutes left. We've reached the end of Battle for Azeroth, essentially. And it seems that we've sort of been building up to this N'Zoth Old God moment for multiple expansions. The payoff, right? We finally have the payoff. Number one, do you feel that fulfilled everything that you wanted it to fulfill? And then number two, are we kind of doing that same build up to something else we don't know about yet? That
always
multiple expansions?
I mean, there are definitely hints about where things are leading us in the future, even beyond Shadowlands, that hopefully people will look back on when we announce what those things are and see. The N'Zoth payoff, I think it's sort of, let's say, overall, I think we're satisfied with how this has turned out.
Yeah.
Definitely heard a lot of feedback from the community. There's some element of just, that was it, disappointment of, this is the last old god, killed him. Well, at the end of the day, we're heroes. We're the champions of Azeroth. It's an MMO, it's a game. We're going to kill things. We're going to kill things, right? Sorry, this is your favorite villain. Yep. We're going to kill the Lich King. We're going to kill Deathwing. We're going to kill Ashar. We're going to kill N'Zoth. Bosses are there to be defeated. Bosses are there to be looted. Yeah. And there's new ones emerging for us to tackle, and the story goes on. So at some level, that's going to be part of it. Now, in the finale, in the cinematic, I think I have a couple. So a regret is how the cinematic was experienced by most people. It was designed with the idea of you, the character, you, the player, being the hero. We're thinking back to criticism that we've got in the past for things like the Dragon Soul finale or otherwise, where it's like, I did all this work, and then like Thrall comes in and blasts him with a beam, and all right, thanks, Thrall, you did it. We wanted to make it clear that, the Azerite, all expansion long, building up your Heart of Azeroth as the champion of Azeroth, trust is placed in you to do this thing. And to have the moment be one of, all right, you're fighting the boss, your hope is almost lost, your sanity is low, you don't have a way of restoring it anymore. In the last second, this cutscene plays, and you see your character do the heroic thing. Right? You're transmog, it's you, the character that you built up for a long time. And I think probably the majority of people first experience that moment through basically vicariously, and unfortunately also through a kind of a semi-data mined reconstruction that didn't even show your raid group in the background. It was just like, all right, I guess I'm alone in a room suddenly, and I'm just shooting a laser at the old god. But the key thing is putting you, the character, into the scene means that by definition it can't be fully pre-rendered. After that finished, we immediately transitioned to a pre-rendered scene showing the aftermath. Right. And this is just purely a creative decision, right? Trying to find ways to place the character at the center of the story that was being told. I've seen some more cynical feedback and criticism in the community about, it's laziness and cutting corners. Like, no, we had other clearly pre-rendered cinematics, the Rathian Anduin intro, Rathian cutting open the carapace of N'Zoth with Xal'atath, and so forth. It wasn't a desire to, save time or money. It was just a desire to find a way to put the player in the scene. We've heard a lot about how that went. It's definitely something we're going to take into account going forward when we consider anything similar.
I think the trade-off to that, I think historically the mythic version of a encounter, especially in bosses, has always been sort of considered the canon version of how things went down. And that may be why it's easier to lean on things like Thrall doing the finishing move or something like that, because that's the canon version of that. So that's a little bit muddled now, because we're all killing N'Zoth in some alternate reality. It was me. The only lore question I'll ask you, and this actually comes from Ro, our friend at Realm Maintenance, he wants to know, are there multiple Hearts of Azeroth, or is there just one? Like, what's the... Because you use multiple Hearts of Azeroth in the Mythic encounter, and therefore...
Yes. I mean, that's... Text, I think... that's one of those areas where honestly, I don't even know what the strictly canon answer is, right? It's the same as the answer to, are there multiple Ashbringers?
Sure.
Right? We've all seen the comic. We all have Ashbringers.
That's
but walking around the Paladin Order Hall, you all have Ashbringers, and yet there clearly was the one blade that was once wielded by Tyrion, used to shatter Frostmourne, and then later recovered. But we're each playing through our own story.
That's right.
So.
Okay. Well, any last thoughts you might have on how things went, or what we can expect in Shadowlands?
We're going to have a lot more to talk about with Shadowlands in the very near future. So it's been really fun to talk about this with you, to look back at visions and how Ny'alotha have unfolded, and really excited to share what the team's been working on and what the future has in store with Shadowlands pretty soon.
All right. Well, thanks, Ian. Appreciate you taking some time.
No, it's a pleasure.
All right.